On one of the great highways between New York and Philadelphia stood an old ramshackle, time-worn barn, worth less than $50. With the aid of a little lumber and some cement plus imagination, this old barn has been turned into a beautiful automobile supply station that earns a small fortune for the man who supplied the imagination. Across the street from my office is a little print shop that earns coffee and rolls for its owner and his helper, but no more. Less than a dozen blocks away stands one of the most modern printing plants in the world, whose owner spends most of his time traveling and has far more wealth than he will ever use. 22 years ago, those two printers were in business together. The one who owns the big print shop had the good judgment to ally himself with a man who mixed imagination with printing. This man of imagination is a writer of advertisements, and he keeps the printing plant with which he is associated supplied with more business than it can handle by analyzing its client's business, creating attractive advertising features, and supplying the necessary printed material with which to make these features of service. This plant receives top-notch prices for its printing because the imagination mixed with that printing produces a product that most printers cannot supply. In the city of Chicago, the level of a certain boulevard was raised, which spoiled a row of beautiful residences because the sidewalk was raised to the level of the second-story windows. While the property owners were bemoaning their ill fortune, a man of imagination came along, purchased the property for a song, converted the second stories into business property, and now enjoys a handsome income from his rentals. As you read these lines, please keep in mind all that was stated in the beginning of this lesson, especially the fact that the greatest and most profitable thing you can do with your imagination is the act of rearranging old ideas in new combinations. If you properly use your imagination, it will help you convert your failures and mistakes into assets of priceless value. It will lead you to discovery of a truth known only to those who use their imagination, namely, that the greatest reverses and misfortunes of life often open the door to golden opportunities. One of the finest and most highly paid engravers in the United States was formerly a mail carrier. One day he was fortunate enough to be on a streetcar that met with an accident and had one of his legs cut off. The street railway company paid him $5,000 for his leg. With this money he paid his way through school and became an engraver. The product of his hands, plus his imagination, is worth much more than he could earn with his legs as a mail carrier. He discovered that he had imagination when it became necessary to redirect his efforts as a result of the streetcar accident. You will never know what is your capacity for achievement until you learn how to mix your efforts with imagination. The products of your hands minus imagination will yield you but a small return. But those selfsame hands, when properly guided by imagination, can be made to earn you all the material wealth you can use. There are two ways in which you can profit by imagination. You can develop this faculty in your own mind, or you can ally yourself with those who have already developed it. Andrew Carnegie did both. He not only made use of his own fertile imagination, but he gathered around him a group of other men who also possessed this essential quality, for his definite purpose in life called for specialists, whose imagination ran in numerous directions. In that group of men that constituted Mr. Carnegie's mastermind were men whose imaginations were confined to the field of chemistry. He had other men in the group whose imaginations were confined to finances. He had still others whose imaginations were confined to salesmanship, one of whom was Charles M. Schwab, who is said to have been the most able salesman on Mr. Carnegie's staff. If you feel that your own imagination is inadequate, you should form an alliance with someone whose imagination is sufficiently developed to supply your deficiency. There are various forms of alliance. For example, there is the alliance of marriage and the alliance of a business partnership, and the alliance of friendship and the alliance of employer and employee. Not all men have the capacity to serve their own best interests as employers, and those who haven't this capacity may profit by allying themselves with men of imagination who have such capacity. It is said that Mr. Carnegie made more millionaires of his employees than any other employer in the steel business. Among these was Charles M. Schwab, who displayed evidence of the soundest sort of imagination by his good judgment in allying himself with Mr. Carnegie. It is no disgrace to serve in the capacity of employee. To the contrary, it often proves to be the most profitable side of an alliance, since not all men are fitted to assume the responsibility of directing other men. Perhaps there is no field of endeavor in which imagination plays such an important part as it does in salesmanship. The master salesman sees the merits of the goods he sells or the service he is rendering in his own imagination, and if he fails to do so, he will not make the sale. A few years ago, a sale was made which is said to have been the most far-reaching and important sale of its kind ever made. The object of the sale was not merchandise, but the freedom of a man who was confined in the Ohio penitentiary and the development of a prison reform system that promises a sweeping change in the method of dealing with unfortunate men and women who have become entangled in the meshes of the law. That you may observe just how imagination plays the leading part in salesmanship, I will analyze this sale for you, with due apologies for personal references which cannot be avoided without destroying much of the value of the illustration. A few years ago, I was invited to speak before the inmates of the Ohio Penitentiary. When I stepped upon the platform, I saw in the audience before me a man whom I had known as a successful businessman more than 10 years previously. That man was B., whose pardon I later secured, and the story of whose release has been spread upon the front page of practically every newspaper in the United States. Perhaps you will recall it. After I had completed my address, I interviewed Mr. B. and found out that he had been sentenced for forgery for a period of 20 years. After he had told me his story, I said, "I will have you out of here in less than 60 days. With a forced smile, he replied, "I admire your spirit, but question your judgment. Why, do you know that at least 20 influential men have tried every means at their command to get me released without success? It can't be done." I suppose it was that last remark, "It can't be done," that challenged me to show him that it could be done. I returned to New York City and requested my wife to pack her trunks and get ready for an indefinite stay in the city of Columbus, where the Ohio Penitentiary is located. I had a definite purpose in mind. That purpose was to get B out of the Ohio Penitentiary. Not only did I have in mind securing his release, but I intended to do it in such a way that his release would erase from his breast the scarlet letter of convict, and at the same time reflect credit upon all who helped to bring about his release. Not once did I doubt that I would bring about his release, for no salesman can make a sale if he doubts that he can do it. My wife and I returned to Columbus and took up permanent headquarters. The next day I called on the governor of Ohio and stated the object of my visit in about these words: "Governor, I have come to ask you to release B from the Ohio Penitentiary. I have sound reason for asking his release, and I hope you will give him his freedom at once, but I have come prepared to stay until he is released, no matter how long that may be." During his imprisonment, B has inaugurated a system of correspondence instruction in the Ohio Penitentiary, as you of course know. He has influenced 1,729 of the 2,518 prisoners of the Ohio Penitentiary to take up courses of instruction. He has managed to beg sufficient textbooks and lesson materials with which to keep these men at work on their lessons, and has done this without a penny of expense to the state of Ohio. The warden and the chaplain of the penitentiary tell me that he has carefully observed the prison rules. Surely a man who can influence 1,729 men to turn their efforts toward self-betterment cannot be a very bad sort of fellow. I have come to ask you to release B because I wish to place him at the head of a prison school that will give the 160,000 inmates of the other penitentiaries of the United States a chance to profit by his influence. I am prepared to assume full responsibility for his conduct after his release. That is my case, but before you give me your answer, I want you to know that I am not unmindful of the fact that your enemies will probably criticize you if you release him. In fact, if you release him, it may cost you many votes if you run for office again. With his fist clenched and his broad jaw set firmly, Governor Vic Donahue of Ohio said, "If that is what you want with B, I will release him if it costs me 5,000 votes. However, before I sign the pardon, I want you to see the Clemency Board and secure its favorable recommendation. I want you also to secure the favorable recommendation of the warden and the chaplain of the Ohio Penitentiary. You know a governor is amenable to the court of public opinion, and these gentlemen are the representatives of that court." The sale had been made, and the whole transaction had required less than 5 minutes. The next day I returned to the governor's office, accompanied by the chaplain of the Ohio Penitentiary, and notified the governor that the clemency board, the warden, and the chaplain all joined in recommending the release. 3 days later the pardon was signed, and B walked through the big iron gates, a free man. I have cited the details to show you that there was nothing difficult about the transaction. The groundwork for the release had all been prepared before I came upon the scene. B had done that by his good conduct and the service he had rendered those 1,729 prisoners. When he created the world's first prison correspondence school system, he created the key that unlocked the prison doors for himself. Why then had the others who asked for his release failed to secure it? They failed because they used no imagination. Perhaps they asked the governor for B's release on the ground that his parents were prominent people, or on the ground that he was a college graduate and not a bad sort of fellow. They failed to supply the governor of Ohio with the sufficient motive to justify him in granting a pardon. For had this not been so, he would undoubtedly have released B long before I came upon the scene and asked for his release. Before I went to see the governor, I went over all the facts, and in my imagination I saw myself in the governor's place and made up my mind what sort of a presentation would appeal most strongly to me if I were in reality in his place. When I asked for B's release, I did so in the name of the 160,000 unfortunate men and women inmates of the prisons of the United States who would enjoy the benefits of the correspondence school system that he had created. I said nothing about his prominent parents. I said nothing about my friendship with him during former years. I said nothing about his being a deserving fellow. All these matters might have been used as sound reasons for his release, but they seemed insignificant when compared with the bigger and sounder reason that his release would be of help to 160,000 other people who would feel the influence of his correspondence school system after his release. When the governor of Ohio came to a decision, I doubt not that B was of secondary importance as far as his decision was concerned. The governor no doubt saw a possible benefit not to B alone, but to 160,000 other men and women who needed the influence that B could supply if released. And that was imagination. It was also salesmanship. In speaking of the incident after it was over, one of the men who had worked diligently for more than a year in trying to secure B's freedom asked, "How did you do it?" And I replied, "It was the easiest task I ever performed, because most of the work had been done before I took hold of it. In fact, I didn't do it. B did it himself." This man looked at me in bewilderment. He did not see that which I am here trying to make clear, namely that practically all difficult tasks are easily performed if one approaches them from the right angle. There were two important factors entering B's release. The first was the fact that he had supplied the material for a good case before I took it in charge, and the second was the fact that before I called on the governor of Ohio, I so completely convinced myself that I had a right to ask for B's release, that I had no difficulty in presenting my case effectively. Go back to what was stated in the beginning of this lesson on the subject of telepathy, and apply it to this case. The governor could tell long before I had stated my mission that I knew I had a good case. If my brain did not telegraph this thought to his brain, then the look of self-confidence in my eyes and the positive tone of my voice made obvious my belief in the merits of my case. Again, I apologize for these personal references with the explanation that I have used them only because the whole of America was familiar with the B case that I have described. I disclaim all credit for the small part I played in the case, for I did nothing except use my imagination as an assembly room in which to piece together the factors out of which the sale was made. I did nothing except that which any salesman of imagination could have done. It requires considerable courage to prompt one to use the personal pronoun as freely as has been used in relating the facts connected with this case. But justification lies in the value of application of the principle of imagination to a case with which nearly everybody is familiar. I cannot recall an incident in my entire life in connection with which the soundness of the 15 factors that enter into this reading course was more clearly manifested than it was in securing the release of B. It is but another link in a long chain of evidence that proves to my entire satisfaction the power of imagination as a factor in salesmanship. There are endless millions of approaches to every problem, but there is only one best approach. Find this one best approach and your problem is easily solved. No matter how much merit your goods may have, there are millions of wrong ways in which to offer them. Your imagination will assist you in finding the right way. In your search for the right way in which to offer your merchandise or your services, remember this peculiar trait of mankind. Men will grant favors that you request for the benefit of a third person when they would not grant them if requested for your benefit. Compare this statement with the fact that I asked the governor of Ohio to release B not as a favor to me and not as a favor to B, but for the benefit of 160,000 unfortunate inmates of the prisons of America.